I wonder if we'll be in for a little deja vu today. You see, the last time I reviewed a watch at this price point, the brand cut me off and hasn't spoke to me since. Yeah, that stern glass Canton had the Swiss-made label on it and cost a pretty penny, but was, in my eyes, a £300 watch marked up to over £700 for no measurable reason. As a result, that one was made obsolete by a far more affordable option in their own lineup. Therefore, I was simultaneously captivated and hesitant when a different micro brand called Maen got in touch via email. You see, on the surface, the proposition was quite similar. A premium-priced mechanical watch with a Swiss-made stamp on the dial, from another brand with some obscure European connections. The brand is Swedish, the founders are Dutch, and the watches are named after American places. Pretty confusing, right? This brand even began through Kickstarter, a platform where many dubious watch brands have also been birthed. Nevertheless, the watch itself looked very promising. An attractive and well-spec'd Swiss-made automatic diver that came in at just 38mm, making it too tempting to ignore. So I did some quick research on the brand, and from what I can gather, they don't appear to be out to steal your cash and run for the hills, which is refreshing. In fact, the feedback on the brand was great, so I accepted their invitation to review one of their watches. I've been trying it out for the last few weeks, but how does it hold up for around 375 quid? Is most of the retail price a result of that Swiss-made label? Or is this actually a viable option for those looking for a smaller diver? Well, the watch is linked below. Let's get into it. The watch arrived in some slick packaging, which tightly squeezes everything in without much junk. I think it's pleasant enough to leave a good impression and protect the watch as well, without being a resource hog. The last thing you'd want is for someone to dump tons of money into the packaging and then the watch actually be rubbish. With my calipers, this Hudson Mark III measured in at exactly 38mm wide, with a depth of 12.5mm, which includes the domed crystal, and a modest 45.5mm lug-to-lug size. After having had so many larger dive watches in the studio recently, it's sweet having something that fits me very nicely. Here's a watch on my thin 15.5cm wrist, and I think it looks mega. The relatively slim case allows for good weight distribution around the whole wrist, and the watch doesn't slide about, as is often the case for larger, more top-heavy dive watches. Straight away, first impressions were excellent. When you're spending a fair chunk of change on a watch, you'd want it to feel premium, and that's definitely the case here. The level of fit and finish is the highest I've seen since the £1,000 Jeanneau Ocean Rover, which in itself wasn't far from a Rolex in terms of raw build quality. At least according to those who've got access to Rolexes. I don't think this stainless steel Maen is quite on the level of the Jeanneau, but for around £400 it's surprisingly close. The flanks of the watch have a true high-polish mirror finish, that while a fingerprint magnet look very slick indeed. Sandwiching the slim chamfer is a brushed upper, which is very finely done and integrates seamlessly with the finishing on the bracelet. The most impressive part is how sharp the transitions between each of these sections are. When you put it side by side with a more affordable alternative from my recent dive watch roundup, it's immediately apparent that the Maen is a tier above. Not only can you see the difference, but you can literally feel it in your hands. This Hudson also has a very secure bezel action with good alignment and zero backplay, whilst the crown is easy to operate thanks to the highly grippy grooves. As you'd expect, the diver design boasts a high water resistance of 200 meters, partly thanks to that screw-down crown. You also get a screwed exhibition case back, which allows you to get a view of the decorated movement within. I've covered other watches that feature this STP-111 movement before. It's essentially a direct clone of the ETA 2824-2, and as such is a very reliable companion to a watch in this price bracket. 28,800 beats per hour is the norm here, which makes the second hand noticeably smoother than cheaper movements operating at a lower beat rate. This particular unit is decorated to a good standard with delicate ribbing forming the backdrop to the main branded rotor, along with perlage circular brushing across the surface of the support plate. Overall, this creates a multi-textured look with a near holographic aesthetic that makes a statement when revealed under bright lights. This embellishment doesn't add anything to the functionality of the watch, but it sure does look great, which is what you'd want when spending this much money on a wristwatch. The only caveat here is that this movement has a ghost position, due to the lack of a date window on this particular model. The first step when you pull out the crown essentially does nothing. Other variants do have a date window, though I like the cleaner lines of this one. Visually, the Hudson handsomely opts for a somewhat vintage, dressier vibe than many of its toolwatch rivals. This particular pre-release version comes kitted out with a black sandblasted dial, the tone of which is somewhat colorized by the crystal above. This darker tone contrasts nicely with the white baton markers around the circumference, enhancing visibility. Thankfully that's the case, as the domed sapphire crystal naturally induces some reflections, and it sure makes my job of getting this footage a lot more difficult. The shape does enable some gorgeous vintage-looking distortion when viewed from steep angles, and you'll also notice some blue hues emanating from the anti-reflective coating, which neatly complements the dial beneath. One of the more unusual aspects of this watch is the handset. Here Maen has opted for hybrid baton syringe hands, similar to those we've seen crop up on some other more expensive dive watches. I'm unsure who was the first to introduce these, but they fit the bill, and the central luminescent slice perfectly matches those on the markers. When you zoom in, they're also finished very nicely, with a glossy faceted appearance and no notable imperfections. The printed text is precise throughout, including that on the rehaut. Unlike some alternatives, I like the restrained approach here, with very little wording overall, so as not to diminish the overall appearance. As a whole, luminescence is reasonable, though not impressive. The C1 Super Luminova does make the watch readable at night, but it fades to a low level rather quickly. One of my favourite parts of the watch is the second hand, which houses a circular pop of lume above the narrow tip. I made a mistake in the dive watch video, put 200mm. Something I'm more 50-50 on is the 20mm bracelet. Now with its solid steel links and excellent finishing, this should be a no-brainer. However, rather unexpectedly, I found that this one has repeatedly pulled hairs on my arm. By no means is this a constant occurrence, but it's happened often enough for me to bring it up in this review. I anticipate that the segmented central links have played a part in this, as they create more spaces for hairs to get caught in. When the bracelet isn't tugging though, it wears very nicely on wrist, and the fully articulating end links mean that various wrist sizes will be easily accommodated. There's also a nicely cut clasp with the same brushed finish and a couple of micro adjustment holes which should suffice given the small size of the links. On wrist, I think it looks gorgeous and oozes class. It both looks and feels like it justifies its price point, which I never thought I'd be saying about a brand originating from Kickstarter. Of course, I have some moans and niggles, as just one more watch would say. This time there were a couple of alignment errors. Firstly, the M logo on the crown seems to be sitting just left of the centre. Additionally, the 12 o'clock marker doesn't appear to be perfectly square with the 60 on the chapter ring. I think that's also positioned a touch to the left, though that could be my deteriorating eyes playing up. There's nothing glaringly wrong with this unit, and I'm happy to say it appears the Swiss-made label hasn't just been thrown on there in a poor attempt to justify the cost of the watch. Personally, I've never been fixated on Swiss-made watches. There's some debate on what that even constitutes anymore. However, I feel confident in saying that this is a great watch outside of any designation. If this were fully Chinese, I think this video would have gone very similarly, so the reduced proportion of the cheap labour involved is a nice boon too. I'm excited to see what this brand pumps out next. I'll link the watch down below. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.